I'm Cody Rosenblatt. I'm CTO at Katalon, and I'm here today with our partners at Curiosity to talk about enhancing SDLC traceability through test automation. And I will go over a little bit of housekeeping that you probably already saw. You're all on as attendees. I think you're all connected. That's how we can see you. If you have any questions, the best way to add them is through Q&A, because that'll structure them as official questions versus just general chat. But you can also drop questions in the chat if that works better for you. We'll probably hold questions until the end and get to them then. If we see something that comes up, in the middle of things and makes sense, we may address that. And then I think we've got everything else. Oh, we are recording this session and we will share it after the fact. So if you want to send it to colleagues or review it or anything like that, you don't have to worry about taking screenshots now, etc. So without further ado, I already introduced myself. I'm Cody Rosenblatt, CTO at Katalon. If you don't know us already, Katalon accelerates end-to-end software development with an all-in-one quality management platform, enabling teams of any size to deliver world-class customer experience. And you may know us best from our Katalon Studio product. I'll talk about where that fits in our platform and some of the additional products we've added. But this will be mostly about the topic. I won't dig into product pitches too much. And with that, I will hand it over to James just to give you a little intro to Curiosity and himself. And then the way we'll structure things is I'll talk a little bit about Katalon and the way we can help you organize your tests, optimize their execution, and connect them to requirements. Then we're going to hand it over to James, where he'll pick up and I think introduce you to some really interesting work that Curiosity has done in this space, particularly with respect to requirements traceability and test optimization. So James will go through that, and then we'll wrap up with some question and answer. James, I'll give you a little intro.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cody. Absolute pleasure to be on today. So yeah, my name's James Walker. I'm one of the co-founders of Curiosity Software. We kind of operate in two main areas. The one area that we operate in is called the test data space, test data automation. And what we basically do is we are able to provide testers and developers with the high quality data they need to test with and also develop with. The other space that we're in is something which is called model-based testing. And that is where we have built out a really powerful integration with Katalon, which is what we're going to be highlighting today. And the main kind of motivation there is we are able to accelerate test automation, introduce test coverage, and also introduce traceability across the whole software development lifecycle, which is, the primary focus of today's conversation. So yeah, I'm going to hand back to Cody. I'm very excited for this webinar, and hopefully you enjoy what you see. So yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, James. So just to set up a little context for basically the problem that I think we're all facing and what Katalon and Curiosity are here to solve, or at least help mitigate. The problem is that increasingly, every industry is being, consumed by software. Healthcare, financial services, education, transportation. Everything depends on software for its operations these days. Even more so, during, and hopefully we're slightly maybe past COVID. And that just creates tremendous demand on organizations to deliver software more effectively, more efficiently, faster, and while maintaining high quality output. But we know that that requires testing. And traditionally that's been done manually. We know we can automate that. Katalon has a set of tools that help you automate. Sorry, I went in the wrong direction. From our studio product for developing low-code test automation, to our test ops product for orchestrating those tests and managing them, to our test cloud product for executing those tests across a range of devices and browsers. But all that automation isn't the complete solution, because automation does make it easier for you to re-execute tests, to build test suites, but ultimately you've still got tests to execute, and you need to be able to execute them intelligently. So what I'm going to start out talking about are the ways that Katalon can help you structure your test suites, and optimize them for execution, and also how you can connect those tests to your requirements so that you have a good idea of what's getting covered, where errors are occurring, etc. And then, like I said, after we look at what Katalon can do on its own, I'm going to turn it over to James to show you what Curiosity has done with Katalon and their test and their model-based testing approach and their approaches for managing test data as well. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of things. So broadly about organizing tests. Within the Katalon terminology, that involves creating tests, putting them into test suites, putting those into test suite collections. Then I'm going to go on and talk about ways that you can add metadata to your tests in those suites with tagging, and then how that enables you to create test suites that are not just static, but actually dynamic suites based on the metadata information about those tests. Finally, I'll talk about the ability to attach tests to requirements so that you can get traceability from your requirements to your tests and back. And like I said, then I'll pass it over to James. So obviously, like the first step in your test automation process is just getting tests written. And at the beginning of that process, you'll probably have a flat structure of tests where here you can see I've created a few tests. They're just within my test folder. I'm just getting started. As I grow my test inventory, I may start organizing those tests into collections, into folders, based on any number of decisions. Often it's based on sort of functional groupings. You may also have groupings that are based on priorities or particular technologies you want to investigate. That's kind of up to you. Over time, those are going to get more and more elaborate as you add deeper and deeper groupings and ways to organize those. And then eventually, you're going to get to the point where you want to take those tests and put them into another set of, another type of test collection. And in Katalon, that's something we call a test suite. So now you've got your inventory of tests. Now you can start putting them together in ways that maybe you structure them so that you can have a group of tests that are critical and ensure that your software is sort of minimally functional, and then another set of tests that you use for your complete regression tests. There's any number of ways that you may structure these suites, but it kind of gives you within the Katalon environment two ways to organize. You've got both your directory structure within your test collection, and then you've got a separate set of test suites that you can pull from multiple collections to gather them together. We also have in Katalon what is called a test suite collection. So that may seem like a lot of the use of collection, but what a test suite collection is intended to do is give you a way to take a set of test suites and then run them across different configurations. So, for example, you may choose to run a test suite across different browser versions browsers and browser versions, operating systems. You may also want to run them in different configurations. So, for example, you can attach different default settings to the same test suite multiple times within a collection, so that you can run it in different client configurations, or perhaps in different configurations depending on geography. There's a whole host of different reasons and ways that you can address that. I've talked to you about how you can organize your test cases into folders, and then how you can also organize them into suites. But in all those cases, you've got a relatively static hierarchical form that you are working with. Within Katalon, you also have the ability to organize across all these hierarchies using tags. And tags you can think of as the same sort of tagging that you're familiar with in your file system or various other information systems. Those tags can be applied to any test within any part of your hierarchy. And you may use tags for things like test priority. Is this a critical test? Is it high, medium, low? You could use it for, again, things like different domains within your overall application under test. And the thing that tags let you do is start to, again, pull tests from across your hierarchy and group them together, even though they may be in separate parts of your sort of conceptual hierarchy. So, for example, maybe you've grouped your tests by functional domain, but you want to be able to access all the high priority tests across all those functions. Or maybe you've grouped them across functional domain, but you want to be able to grab all the tests that exercise a particular technical component. Maybe it's some part of your user interface framework that's changed, or maybe it's a backend element that's changed and it's affected all of your functionality. And where that test case tagging really becomes powerful is in sort of the final organization structure that I'll talk about today in Katalon, and that's in dynamic test suites. When I talked to you about our structure of test suites earlier, I told you could take tests from anywhere in your test case hierarchy and put them into a test suite, but you've got to do that effectively manually. You're figuring out, maybe I want to take all the tests from this domain and put them into a test suite. What a dynamic test suite lets you do is use any of the features of the test, its name, its ID, comments in the test, but I think most usefully tags on that test, to select tests into a dynamic test suite. And what's particularly powerful about that is that dynamic test suite will update anytime you add to your test inventory. So let's say you built your dynamic test suite initially to select high priority tests across your test inventory. Anytime you add a new high priority test anywhere within your test hierarchy, that test will show up now in your dynamic test suite. And as we pivot into James's part, I think you'll see more about how some of that dynamism can be expressed in their world as well. So that's a little bit about how Katalon can help you structure your tests and manage your test execution so that you can test more effectively, so that you can optimize the set of tests that you need to run at any given time. Now I want to pivot and talk a little bit about traceability and how Katalon works with your requirement system to connect tests to requirements and vice versa. And this may not jump out at you, it's a rather subtle point in the screen, but we have an integration, for example, with Jira. And what that integration allows us to do is connect a test. In this case, this is a simple calculator BDD example, but it can be any test and of any complexity. You can connect that test to a Jira requirement, to a Jira ticket. And here you can see sort of the standard Jira ticket structure of, I'm in a given project, and this is test number or requirement number 4 in that. And what this connection between your test and your requirements enables is the ability to move back and forth between the two. So you can go from Jira to see your test. You can also go from your test to see your Jira requirements that underlie it. And then you can see within Jira, through our Jira plugin, you can see what the current status of testing is on that requirement. So from both sides, you have some visibility into the other side. So in Jira, you can see, I want to check this requirement. Has it been tested and what is its status, and vice versa. You can get into Katalon Studio and go to see, has this requirement been updated? Has this requirement changed in any way that I might need to address? And then within our Katalon Test Ops product, you can see at a glance within our traceability matrix, the sort of current status of your requirements testing. In this case, we're not doing good, but this is a sample project, so that's okay. What each of these rectangles represent in this graph is a requirement, and the size of the rectangle represents how heavily that requirement is tested. The color represents its test status, red, of course, being failing, and green being passing, and then everything in between being some mix of that. We'd love to see some more big green rectangles, but again, as I said, this is a demo, and its intent is to show that we need to do some work. So that was a little bit about what you can do with Katalon. Hopefully, many of you have either are using or have used Katalon and are familiar with that. I hope that might get you to look at some of the features in some more depth. With that, I want to pass it on to James to talk about what they've been doing at Curiosity with their tools and with Katalon. Passing it over to you, James.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think you need to stop sharing so I can
I do.
take over. Excellent. Okay, let me share the screen. So hopefully that's coming through. Expand that out. Okay, right. So I'm going to be talking about traceability, which was very nicely teed up there. And what we're going to be talking about specifically is how we can drive quality throughout the software development lifecycle to basically prioritize based on time and risk. Now, I think, throughout the software development lifecycle, there's obviously lots of different assets and lots of different pieces of information that are being created as a piece of software is developed. So, we may start with the requirements. We may then start developing some code. We may need some test data to be able to develop that code with. We're obviously going to deploy to different environments, our SUT, our test environments, our development environments. And eventually we're going to come along and create some test cases, whether those be manual or whether they be automated. So there's obviously a lot of different moving parts. And I think generally, the closer together these components are, the higher quality output of software we're going to see that's produced. And also the faster teams can move and react to change. Now, in reality, I think in the real world, what we often see is that everything is very far apart. They're separate, disparate systems. I think what we see in the testing and development landscape is there's so many different tools out there. Curiosity, Katalon, we work with many, many different organizations. And I think every company we go into, we see some kind of different technology being used in different ways with different configurations between them. Okay, so there's lots of different tools out there. And I think the real challenge here is that, it's very rare you see these tools actually talking and communicating to each other, with links and connections between them and kind of full traceability. So typically what we're seeing here is a low traceability, a low element of tracking. And clearly as a result of that, our understanding is often out of date. Now, the result of these components being far away and kind of distributed and not connected is that can lead to obviously slower development. It can absolutely lead to lower quality. And also just a lack of understanding, not really know what's going on. What is the impact of this new user story that's coming through? How do we test it? Do we need to test it? Is it going to impact existing functionality? Is it net new? Does it remove stuff, et cetera, et cetera? Now, if we think about these connection points a little bit more, so obviously with requirements, do we understand the test data that our developers and testers are going to need to actually move forward with developing that particular feature? Do we have all the data to develop and test the requirement? Do we know the code that's going to be affected by a requirement? If we change our code, do we know what requirements are impacted, bidirectionally as a result? Does the test have the data needed to run? Do you know which data is being used for each test? Do your tests test your requirement, which is obviously pretty crucial. If we're developing new requirements, we obviously want to test that the functionality that's created is actually meets the initial requirement. Are all the tests linked to the requirement? Do you have all the data to develop with? If the characteristics change, do you know which code to change? So you'll see here, there's lots of different questions. And the underlying theme here is that to be able to answer these questions, with a high degree of confidence, traceability is actually, absolutely crucial. So, obviously we've got quite a few people on the call today, or maybe you're listening to the recording, but hopefully some of these will resonate with some of the problems or challenges you're seeing within your organization if you're facing low traceability, especially in the testing space. So some symptoms of low traceability that we've seen in some of the organizations we've worked with, maybe that you have low or unmeasurable coverage. You don't really know what your test cases are covering, or you do know that you have a low level of coverage and your test suite is actually pretty ineffective. Bugs may be found late, or it may be costing a lot to remediate bugs that are being found later on. So, I think it's fairly typical for most organizations that, to actually have a feature tested, properly with automation. Sometimes that doesn't happen until a couple of months after software is released, which is actually pretty bad, especially if, you're in some kind of critical organization or, in an organization or space where defects are actually very costly, like the financial space. I think we're often seeing an over-reliance on manual test creation. So there's still a lot of manual testing going on, especially in terms of creating tests, manually checking and fixing brittle tests. I think anyone in the automation space, pretty much knows that, test maintenance can pretty much kill any return on investment expected from test automation, pretty quickly, right? We spend more time and money fixing our tests than we actually do that we saved by creating them, as automated tests in the first place. I think the second to last one here, is about test data. Test data, again, can very quickly destabilize any test automation. And what we typically see is that, testers, developers, they spend a lot of time searching for the right test data they need for their test cases, which can obviously slow down testing cycles. But also when you think about test automation, you need very deterministic, highly available test data to be able to execute those automated tests. And what we typically see over time is that automated tests start failing, not because there's something wrong with the system, but because the test data that test was expecting is no longer available. And that could be, because of environments being reset, tests interfering with each other's test data, among many other means. And then the final one here, mounting technical debt. I think with the pace of Agile now, development teams are able to move extremely quickly. Testing is still kind of lagging behind a little bit. And often, we're kind of faced with this ever growing kind of mountain of stuff that we have to test and assure. And typically, either we end up delaying our software development lifecycle, or things end up, going through the cracks, and that's where we see bugs being found later, on. So what I want to jump into today, and this is kind of where we're heading into the demo, is we're going to look at something that we're calling the Traceability Lab. Okay, And the Traceability Lab basically goes through and scans and synchronizes data from lots of different data sources in the software development lifecycle. So these are things like code check-ins, run results, user stories, data, behavior, sentiment analysis, requirements, and much, much more. Okay. And the first piece that we're going to look at here is how we can firstly explore this data, start to have a little look around, see some of the connections, which is quite interesting. We're then going to look at how we can apply some rules and patterns to determine risk and the impact of change. So we're kind of thinking from the perspective of providing kind of an early warning system to start to identify bad behaviors and things that look potentially risky. The final piece here is we're going to look directly into the world of modeling. So modeling to us is kind of the core crucial component that's needed for traceability. And this is very much going to be about creating coverage-focused Katalon scripts, which are also risk-based, and they can feed back into our traceability engine. So with that being said, let's scrap the slides for now, and let's jump directly into looking at some real-world stuff.
This is the exciting part.
I hope so. So within the software development lifecycle, as we said before, there's lots of different assets. You know, we've got things like requirements, we've got things like code, we've got things like test cases. We've obviously got lots of different people, interacting throughout the software development lifecycle. And then finally, we've also got test data, which is a pretty critical component. Now, what we're going to look at in this demo is we're going to look at a few different data sources. Okay, the first data source we're going to look at is GitHub, where we're scanning 3 different Git repositories, and we're looking at the commits and the code and analyzing them as they're coming through and as new development artifacts are being created. The second one here is Jira Cloud, which is where our requirements are stored. We've then also got another Jira instance, which is where our test cases are being stored, and that's inside Zephyr. But it could be X-Ray, it could be any other test case management tool. And then we've got another one here, which is going to go into another cloud repository we have to analyze requirements also. Now, while we are doing these scans, what we're basically doing is we're connecting into these data sources, and when we're starting to analyze the different data that's coming through. Okay. And what we're basically doing is we're storing that data inside what's called a graph database. Okay. And this is basically, something that is very well suited to collecting and gathering different traceability between different components. So you'll see here, we've got some components that have been scanned. We could come in and we could select that we're going to start with people. Okay. I'm just going to make this a little bigger. And you'll see here, we've got lots of different people that are involved in our software development lifecycle. Now, let's just pick out one particular person here. So let's pick out this person. And what we're going to do is we're going to explode on them. Now, what you'll see here is that we have a central project, which everyone is linked to, which is great. If we look at this one person here, Shash, what you'll see is that he has lots of different commits associated with him. He has some requirements associated. And there are lots of different pieces here that are coming in. Now we can pick more nodes and we can start to expand them out. And what we'll see is that we're actually exploring the different traceability between components. So we're going from commit to requirement to different source code files that are actually, being manipulated and edited. So we can start to explode on these different nodes. We can view the different constellations, and we can really start to see the different traceability between aspects. So that's kind of what's happening in the background. And we think this is, pretty crucial to determining traceability as it's coming through. Now, actually doing something useful with this data, the first element we're going to look at here are being able to overlay rules which look for good activity and also bad activity and bad patterns that are happening, as new activity is coming through. And being undertaken. And the idea here is that this can be used as an early warning system to identify bad behavior, potentially low areas of low quality that may impact us later on. So we could be looking at commits which have no requirement associated with them. We could be looking at a requirement which is still in a backlog state, but someone has committed some code for it. Okay. We could be looking at commits which impact a very high amount of the code. We could be looking at requirements that are flip-flopping backwards and forwards. It's closed and then a defect has been found, and it's closed again, another defect has been found. We could be looking at requirements where the sentiment analysis, as in, is it the comments on this requirement positive, negative, etc. We could be looking at requirements where there are no test cases, where there's no assignee, where there is unusual behavior in the commit, such as someone who has committed a new piece of code, but they do not have experience with the particular source code files that they are editing. So there's lots of different rules that we can start to overlay on this data to look for bad patterns. And the idea would be is as you go through your software development lifecycle, as bad patterns appear, that is something that can be added with new quality gates to start to identify potential areas of risk in terms of quality. Now, what we're going to do here, firstly, is we're going to focus on just two elements, just to give you a bit of an idea of some of these quality risks and some of these traceability, as an overview. So the first thing we're seeing here is a commit, okay? And this is a commit that has been made, last year, which is fine. And what you'll see here is that this had 1,452 lines of code were edited. Now, if I scroll down here, what you'll see is that there were 3 quality risks associated with this commit. The author, Andre, has previously not been associated with one of the files referenced in this commit. And we can take a look and we can see this is the file that they have no experience with. So a developer is coming, they've edited a piece of code they've never edited before. So potentially this is a commit that we want to focus on our quality a little bit more and test around this piece of functionality and the stuff that has been changed as a result. What we'll also see is that the total code changes is above a certain, there's no linked requirements. Okay. Now, there's also some good things here. The sentiment has a score of neutral. The total impacted commits was below a defined threshold, and the commit has an author, which is great. If we scroll down a little bit, what you'll see is some of the traceability that has been tracked. Now, just because this commit has been made does not mean it is siloed. Every commit and piece of code changes can also affect other pieces of functionality. So if you think about that in the terms of traceability, we are going from a code change. We are then looking at that code change. We're linking it to a requirement. And then we're looking at all of the different code that has been impacted by every other requirement and making connections from them. So we're seeing here that this one piece of commit that has been made to one particular file has actually impacted 190 other pieces of functionality. So that's actually a pretty big commit that changes a lot of fundamental or touches a lot of fundamental functionality within our application. Now, if we just come over here, the next thing we're going to look at is a requirement that has been made inside Jira. Okay, and you'll see here some of the textual based descriptions. It's actually got a status of done at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what you'll see down here is this requirement has been linked to 7 pieces of code. What you'll also see is that there are 0 test cases associated with it, and there are 0 models. Okay, now immediately what I can see here is we have code that's been committed, but we do not have any tests with it. Okay, and that is something that has been picked up here as a quality risk. The requirement has no directly linked test cases to it. Okay, what's also interesting here and what you'll see is that there has also been some textual based analysis that has been made against this requirement. Now, one of the tools that we partnered with here is called Scope Master. And what that has basically done is it's scanned this textual based requirement. It's applied, I think, something like 10,000 rules, which apply natural language processing to this requirement. And basically what it's come out with here is a quality score of 0. And it's made some recommendations over why this requirement is bad. So it doesn't refer to any objects. There's no functional sizing. It uses very little verbs to describe what we're doing in terms of, moving data, adding, updating, reading, deleting. So this is giving us, almost, a text checker, a spell checker over our requirement to look for bad activities and good activities. Now, obviously, what we're looking at here, we're identifying bad elements of quality, okay, by looking at the traceability. Now, where we can go in terms of enhancing quality is we can enter the world of modeling, okay? And modeling for us is at the center of traceability. Whenever we create a model from an asset, we maintain a link. We know what requirement it links to. Whenever we create any asset outside of a model, like a test case or automation or test data, we know where that asset lives. And the model is the center of being able to make all of these components between all these applications. Okay. Now, I guess the first thing that people are going to ask here is, what is modeling? Okay. And we're going to come back to this model at the end. But what you're going to see is this is basically a model. It's a flow chart. It's a visual representation of how a particular application should work. Okay. Now, the application we're going to be focusing on today is an e-commerce system. Okay. And this is a fairly standard e-commerce system. We can go in here, we can look at different products. We can add different products to shopping cart. We can go through a checkout process. We can register a new user. And then finally, at the end, we can enter some credit card details and some other assets to actually go through and complete the checkout process. Now, what we have done is we have spent a little bit of time in Katalon Studio building out an object repository for the different components in this e-commerce system. Obviously, we've got a lot of people familiar with Katalon on the call today. But for those of you who aren't familiar, Katalon has a very good scanning capability where we can open a new browser, we can start to scan the components that we care about. And from that particular scan, we can come out and we can build up object repositories. We have all of our different identifiers in for going into that web page and identifying and extracting that particular object. Now, for those of you who have existing Katalon repositories, what you can do is you can come into Test Modeler, you can go to Import, and you can select any repository you have. And you can basically come in and register that and make it available to Test Modeler as something that you want to expose and be consumable. And you'll see here, all of those different assets are being imported. If we come back and take a look, what you'll see is that we have the same folder structure created here with all of our different components. We've got our different actions, and we can come in here. We can see we've got the various different inputs, which we registered, and we can see different actions we can perform on these, like clicking an input, sending keys, submitting, verifying, etc., etc. Now, the fun bit actually comes from creating models. Okay, and this is where we can author the creation of test cases incredibly quickly. So if we come in here, for instance, and let's just create a brand new model. Okay, so this is where we're going to open up our model editor. And this allows us to come in and start to visually define a particular component of our application that we want to model out. So we could come in here and we could focus on the login screen. Okay. The first thing a user is going to want to do is they're going to enter a username. Okay. So we're going to come in here and we're going to say we're going to input users into our application. The next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to input different passwords. So we can come in here and we can select that, and we'll see we've got some more equivalence classes that have been created. Then what we're going to do is we're going to click the sign in button at the end. Okay. Now, if the data we enter is valid and we click the sign in button, we should end up in some kind of successful state where we're logged in. If we end up in some kind of bad state, which is where we enter, negative data, that's where we're going to end up in some kind of error condition. Now, this is basically what modeling is all about. Okay. And you should end up with a model which represents the different paths I can work my way through a component, a system, and the different states I end up in. Now, if you look behind here, we have different test data that's being overlaid. Okay. And, that represents, positive data, also negative data. And we've also got the different Katalon components that are being overlaid to perform the test automation. Now, if I come back to the model I showed you at the beginning, this is where we have gone through and we have created a model which represents a much bigger end-to-end scenario. So this is representing going through ordering an item in our e-commerce system. Now, the way we typically see users utilize and leverage Test Modeler is they will build out a component library of common components for their application. And each of those components represents a model in its own right. So here we've got models for going through the products page, going through a registration page, going through things like the checkout process, going through the shopping cart, et cetera, et cetera. So we have different reusable building blocks for different parts of our application. And then when it comes to building out these end-to-end flows, literally it's a case of dragging and dropping, snapping them together. And you'll see here, I can explode these different sub-processes. And within each of these sub-processes, you'll see they contain their own world of logic in here. Okay. And really, that's what enables teams to move incredibly quickly. You're having a very high level of reusability, but also you're reducing test maintenance. Everything is embedded inside each other. It's very componentized. If something changes, you just need to update it in one place. Now, the power of modeling comes in that we can come in here and we can say, go away and generate some tests for me. And what that is going to do is go away and generate the perfect test suite, which maximizes coverage across the model that we have created. So here, what you'll see is that we have 30 paths. Okay, we have 2 positive ones, which are going through successfully ordering a new item. And then we've got, the rest of them, which are negative, which are covering different routes and deviations through our model. Now, once we have these paths, which, by the way, we can be very expressive over how we generate. So we could specify here to explode on certain areas if we know they're more risky or they have been changed recently or have several pieces of functionality going through them. But once we have these paths, we can do something with them. We could go out into requirement management tools and we can populate them. We can generate any test data we need to in external data sources like relational databases, NoSQL databases, complex JSON and XML structures. We can go and export test cases into our test case management tools. But the final one we care about here is we can actually go in and we can generate automation code. So just by clicking a button, what this is going to do is it's going to go off and generate our automation code for our 30 paths here. And what you'll see is that came back almost immediately. And that has produced the automation code for us in Katalon to be able to execute these tests. So if I flick over now, what we'll actually see, if I go back into Katalon Studio, is we have different tests here that we have produced, which have come through from Test Modeler. And what you'll see in here is that we have all the different statements for navigating to the URL, clicking the different links, entering, the different text into our fields, signing into the application, and eventually going through the checkout process. And we could pick any of these tests. We could pick one off here and we could say, okay, let's go away and run it. And this is where we're going to leverage the full power of Katalon Studio to go off and spin up, the web browser that we're testing against, and it's going to go off and execute that test. And you'll see it runs through it pretty quickly here. Now, as we go through and execute our test suite, what we're actually doing is we are also scanning and tracking the automation code that has been triggered as a result of an execution that's been made. Okay, so you'll see here we've got those various paths. If we come back over here, this is inside a tool which is called For Theorem. Okay, and this goes away and it tracks the automation, the underlying code that has been triggered in the application of the test via the automation code that is executed. And what you'll see here are the different test cases that are listed. From a very high level, we can see, okay, what are the different methods that were hit? How many URLs were called? What databases tables were read? How many writes were there to our different database tables as well? And we could pick off one of these test cases and we could start to look in a bit more detail. So here we're looking at the different structure between the different codes and the different methods that have been hit and executed via that automated test. What we can see here is the different SQL statements that have been triggered as part of a test automation script. And you'll see here the different tables that are being hit and the different queries and columns that are being returned as a result. And you'll see here from a high level view, those exact database accesses, the different URLs that were triggered, the amount of times they were triggered. And also if we go down here, the individual functions and classes and methods that were called as well. Now, once we have all of this data that has been collected, we can start to do some intelligent stuff with it. So firstly, we can start to look at our different test cases and see how much they overlap. And here we've got a Venn diagram, which is looking at each of our individual tests, and it's looking at how much they overlap between each other. And here we have another piece of visualization, which is also looking at the test code, which is overlapping. Now, because we've been able to go from a model to Katalon to be able to trigger and figure out which code is being executed as part of our automation, as part of our software development lifecycle, we're now able to feed this back into our traceability lab. And then going forward, we can make more informed decisions about what models are impacted by a change. We can understand our test cases. We can understand if a new commit comes in, what code has been impacted as a result of that, what test cases have been impacted by that. And we can start to make more informed decisions about risk and the impact of a change that's come through. So I'm just going to wrap up with one slide here, just to kind of finish things off. So one thing we've not touched on here is obviously data, which was one crucial component that I spoke about at the beginning. We have a lot of software in the test data space, which can go through, we can compare data before and after testing. And obviously, as you saw from full theorem there, we're also tracking, the different data that's being accessed and created as we're going through our test automation. So for that, we can very much go in, we can start to track the different data sources that we have in our application, and we can start to make more intelligent decisions over whether we have good data, how we can enrich that data with more rich, combinations that are required. And I think one of the underlying tools that we've seen here today is full theorem, which is being used to track test execution at the data and code level. And from that, we can really understand what's going on under the hood during testing. And based off of that, we can start to make more informed and intelligent decisions, as we're going through our software development lifecycle. So with that being said, Koti, I'm going to hand back over to you just to pick up. Is that okay?
Hey, thank you. I will share my screen. So I think we're ready to move into Q&A before we wrap up. We've got about 10 minutes. There's one for you. George was typing to it, but now that we're live, the question is from Mike, last name blank, or he actually has the last name. You mentioned scanning GitHub repos. What kind of permissions are required for that? Is it done with a GitHub username, or can you add via token testers so that testers can see results without necessarily having access to that repo?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, that is done with read access on via a token-based authentication. We're currently working on extending that to use the GitHub apps, which is kind of the new way of authenticating. But yeah, absolutely. It's not that your testers need access to a Git repository. It can be very much, we're just going to set up a connection. And then as part of that connection, it's going to go away and scan any new commits that come through.
Yeah, and I think that's, we're seeing that more and more with customers and partners, starting to look, further upstream than requirements, well, arguably further upstream. Anyway, looking into code repositories for insight into changes and what needs to get tested. And I think combining that with things like for theorem that have insight into the correlation between test cases and code is really powerful. There were a couple of questions that came up that we answered, in the chat, but I'll address them live too, just in case everybody's not hanging on the Q&A answers. Someone asked whether we can use Azure DevOps with Katalon for requirements traceability. And the answer is yes. We have integration with Azure DevOps test plans. And in the answer, there's a link, but you can also just Google Katalon Azure DevOps, and you'll be taken to our documentation for that feature. It's not, honestly, it's not one-for-one with our Jira integration, but we have roadmap updates coming for that. So you can look for more. And then someone asked, can we use Atlassian for traceability? Obviously, yes. We have very deep integration with Jira that includes a plugin for the Jira environment that allows you to see the current status of testing against a linked requirement. Also attaches test artifacts to requirements so that you can not only see how did they pass or fail, but you can look at screen capture, logs, etc., directly within Jira. There was one question, and I know George has already said we might take it offline, but Russ Thomas asked, during your demo, you talked about the Katalon object repository, and Russ asked, what if my object repository is empty?
Okay, great. So from that perspective, you can do one or two things. Maybe that you've written custom keywords in Katalon, which is how you're driving your automation. So they can be imported in, and that's a great starting point. Or secondly, from that, if the scanner is the right way to go forward in Katalon, then you can go in and you can start to directly scan any new objects that you need, and then they can be directly imported into Test Modeler and utilized. Either of those is fine. Either custom code, if that's how you're using your automation, or if the strategy is that you're going to start using the object repository, you've just not done it yet, then you would start in Katalon, register your objects, and I would recommend actually creating some scripts inside Katalon itself, just to get going. And then when you're ready to kind of move to the next level to start including modeling, that's when you can start to import your object repository and start moving forward. So I would say it's more of an evolution than just start from modeling from the get-go, and hopefully that helps. Yeah,
terrific. I think that's a great answer, and I pitch the utility of our object repository because I think it's something that's often overlooked. It's something you'll come to as you progress in your testing, because you'll realize that you want to have that leverage to be able to both, in the example that James gave, scan to know what objects are available for testing, but also leverage so that if an object changes, most commonly in both web and mobile environments, you change the locator. Somehow an ID has changed or its location has changed on the page. You can have that object repository as a place to change that in one place and have it propagate through your code. So I often ask people to really look at the value there. And it's worth noting too, the easiest way to get those, as James suggested, is by recording a script in Katalon. But you can also there's another tool called Spy. You can use Spy to create elements in your object repository as well, even if you're not scripting on them at the time. So lots of opportunities there. It looks like we have three more questions. Russ says the OR is unobtainable. Russ, you can also email me, and I'm Cody at Katalon, and I'd love to connect, and we can talk more about that, because I certainly don't want you to be stuck with something unmaintainable. Excellent. Thanks, Russ. And I think that is all of our questions for today. With that, I will wrap up. Obviously, we encourage you, if you have not already, please try out Katalon. It is free to use. You can sign up and download it, the Studio product, and you will also have access to our Test Ops product and trial version of Test Cloud. You can follow us on Twitter at Katalon Platform and on LinkedIn at the long URL listed right there. And also get in touch with Curiosity. James, I'll let you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested, feel free to shoot us an email, which was james.walker@curiosity.software. And you can also head over to testmodeler.io as well. But yeah, I think, the end result here is, the combination of both tools is incredibly powerful. So if you're interested, get in touch with us or get in touch with Katalon, and we'd be more than happy to share those conversations together. So yeah, thank you.
Well, terrific. I really enjoyed getting to see all that, James, and I appreciate everybody who joined us and great questions. I hope this gave you both some things to think about in your quality journey, as well as potentially some tools and processes to apply. Definitely reach out to either one of our companies. We're eager to help. Thanks a lot. Oh, and I have a poll for everybody. I almost forgot. So I'm launching the poll. Would love to have your responses. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, and let us know what products you want to take a look at.